Welcome, everybody. It's great to have you here on this typical Seattle rainy day. My name is Sital Kalantry, and I am a professor of law at the law school in Seattle University, as well as associate dean and director of the Roundglass India Center, which is sponsoring this event. And we have had our first year anniversary just a couple of weeks ago. So as part of our programs, we focus on events is one pillar. Our goals are to use these events as a way to educate and inform our communities about the issues that we think are important, that could use political and social action. So activating communities, both Indian Americans and looking for political and social change in India. I'm so grateful to Shannon, our manager, for organizing all this, Stephanie, and all of the students who did such a wonderful job. I have an extremely amazing panel here to talk about a cutting-edge issue. Seattle University is also at the forefront of technology based in the center of Seattle. We are so delighted to have Consul General Prakash Gupta here with us. He is the top diplomat from India to our entire region, but like 8 states he covers. And he just opened this office also about a year ago. He's had numerous different postings in Beijing, Shanghai, speaks multiple languages. I will not fully introduce our panelists, given the shortage of time we have. Next, we are delighted to have here Sanjay Jain, who's the Director of Digital Public Infrastructure at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, coming here from Bangalore. So thank you for making the longest trip. He has been also a partner at the Bharat Innovation Fund, clearly worked significantly in technology and government issues. We're also delighted to have our very own Professor Bakiner here with us. He's the director of the Technology Ethics Initiative, as well as an associate professor of political science, whose work focuses on ethics and human rights relating to technology. And finally, our also very own Vidushi Chaturvedi, who is not only a student in our Master of Law program, but has worked for a quarter of a century in the Indian government on technology law. So one of the things she does is create all the laws around the technology that we're going to talk about and think about how those might evolve. So just to very briefly introduce our topic, and then I will ask, it'll be a Q&A format, and we'll leave some time for questions with you guys, right? DPI enables governments to interact with their citizens. That's effectively one kind of highlight summary. And India has been one of the most innovative players in the field. The 3 main components of DPI for India is the national ID system known as Aadhaar, a digital payment system, where people like street vendors, you can get chai on, digitally with the 10 cents rather than having to use any cash, and a digilocker to store sensitive information. But with all this excitement, there's always challenges. And I want this panel to be about not just uncovering the wonderful possibilities, but talking about the challenges that have been faced, like data breaches or services. How do you provide services while protecting people's rights? And the businesses, how do we interact with businesses? Because much of this work displaces what people like Amazon or Venmo are doing. And how do we bring those in, or do we displace them? Those are some of the questions that I hope our panelists will address. So my first question, starting with Consul General Gupta. So during the recent Quad not recent, but the Quad meetings that occurred in India, the Quad, which is a group of governments that have gotten together to focus on various issues, but they adopted a resolution on DPI. And even in the most recent visit of Prime Minister Modi to the UN, again, the Quad reaffirmed its commitment to digital public infrastructure. And you guys, the Indian government has been one of these strong voices. Can you explain why the Indian government has a strong commitment to it, and what are some of the success stories that you see in India?
Good evening. And first, on behalf of the Indian Consulate, namaste, greetings to everyone. Thank you for coming. I'd also like to thank Professor Sital Kalantry here and the Roundglass India Center for doing this event today. I also want to thank all the panelists for joining us on this event. When we thought of this idea, I think we really felt that it's important to bring unique success stories from India, which are now resonating globally, particularly in the global south, also to a Western setting. Uh, we've heard about the benefits of digital public infrastructure, of what it has done in India in the UN space. And we felt that it was important that it should also find voice in the bilateral US space also, particularly now with France having adopted UPI very recently and it making its debut there. There were two parts to your question. One was, what is the reason that we are so deeply committed to this concept of the UPI, and what would be its success stories? So look, when you look at India and you looked at our public infrastructure, it wasn't in a very good shape, say 30 years back or 40 years back, given the volumes of people that we handle when it comes to government delivery of public goods. So if I have to put down the single biggest transformative change, which has had an impact across the length and breadth of India, I would say in the last decade plus, the way we have gone about implementing public infrastructure, which gives public delivery of services through the digital platform to the most needy and vulnerable of the society, has been, in my view, in our last decade, the single biggest achievement of all government public policies across platforms. And there is a reason I say this. There was a time when we used to say in India that for every rupee that the government intends to spend on public good, it's hardly 10 paisa that reaches its ultimate beneficiary. We are now at a point of time where out of our 1.4 billion people, the world's largest population, we have 99% of them, nearly 99% of them, close to 1.3 billion people, covered by the combination of Aadhaar and UPI, where what public benefit the government intends to give reaches verbatim in the person's bank account, and he or her, even the most vulnerable, even the most marginalized, now is the master of that benefit to be utilized in a manner that he or she best chooses to use. This is transformatory because this is as direct a government benefit could reach in a South Asian setting, in a developing country setting. And if I remember some of the stats which I penciled down, uh, we used to have at one point of time 1.5 million ghost beneficiaries, beneficiaries that didn't exist. It has eliminated that large a beneficiary subset completely. Overall government spending that could not reach its intended beneficiary was close to $9 billion. This particular decadal transformational change has helped us address that deficit. So what it brings to the table, in my view, is A, inclusivity. There's no differentiation. Once the government decides it is for this sector of people, it reaches them without any intermediary in between. Second, it's the most efficient way of the government engaging its beneficiary. And third, I would say, is the scalability of scaling it up across settings, across geographies. These three are very big benefits that we see as. In terms of success stories, I would just like to say, I would say we all went through a very traumatic phase of the COVID pandemic globally. And in a certain sense, when we talk about the global south, which our panelists will talk about, they felt cheated to a certain extent. The global south was coming out of a crisis which had faced a shortage of food, fertilizers, and fuel in the aftermath of the Ukraine conflict. And then you had this coronavirus, where large sections of populations in Africa, Asia, Southeast Asia were struggling to even get a shot of vaccine, because this was only coming out of designated places to designated geographies. in a period of, I would say, 6 months, we developed a platform called Co-Win platform, which helped India, at least in that most critical phase, entirely our built technology, deliver 2.2 billion vaccine dosages, the first shot and the second shot, with a complete track record of what is going where and when is the second dose needed. Done entirely using Indian technology, Indian scientists. And again, this also was linked to our digital public infrastructure backbone, which other countries in southern settings said, this is something worth taking forward. So if you were to, there is the list of success stories is across the sector, and I think other panelists will talk about it, but it was a very trying and testing phase for the country, where our digital public delivery of good, at least in the case of vaccine, stood that traumatic phase and delivered. And again, 2.2 billion is a number that speaks for itself, wasn't achieved in any geography, any country, any part of the world, the best of the West, the best of the South included. So that's where our commitment, because of these success stories, is stemming from. And that's where we, in our spirit of partaking this with other fellow similar geographies, similar developmental journeys, is where we want to share this experience with other countries in Africa, Asia, Southeast Asia. And we are very happy that now it is also resonating even in the Western world, with the latest example of France taking one of its aspects. Thank you.
So General. So now next question I have is for Sanjay Jain. Mr. Jain, you are at the Gates Foundation doing DPI, leading a team on DPI, right? And when we think of the Gates Foundation, we think of health. We don't necessarily think of digital technologies and their interactions with the government. So can you talk a little bit about your work? And in particular, what I was interested in is how you view these technologies as a way to equalize between vulnerable groups, right? There's a focus on bringing in women, bringing in poor people, and how would this provide government services in a better way?
Thanks for that, Sheetal. So I actually want to build on the Consul General's remarks around what happened in India. So after Aadhaar was launched, and there's a second scheme launched called the Jan Dhan Yojana, Pradhan Mantri Jan Dhan Yojana, which focused on giving bank accounts to everybody. Okay. And that brought in I think over 500 million bank accounts to people, and a lot of those were women. So the act of giving those bank accounts, opening them with the various banks, was done through Aadhaar eKYC, which enabled people to onboard very quickly and cheaply into bank accounts. That brought the gender gap in bank account ownership to zero. The gap between men having a bank account and women having a bank account came to zero. That was something which is, an example of how you can use digital technologies to bridge these gaps and to solve those problems. Second, the DBT money went directly into those accounts, and a lot of schemes were created where the money was going to the female head of the household. And that, again, there has been actually RCTs to prove that when you give money to the female and she has the ability to take the money without the male in the loop, it gets spent on food, it gets spent on food for the girl child, better toys. The developmental outcomes of that are extremely positive. And that's, again, something which you can only do with digital and with this DPI approach. Another example, again, during the pandemic, if you recall, most governments rolled out aid to their people. Around the world, the countries that did it digitally, and it's not just India, right? Many countries did it digitally. And wherever it was done digitally, the aid reached people way faster than where it was not. So when you had digital public infrastructure, the emergency response from the government was much better. It reached people much faster than where it was not. And so in India, the example is that there was a lockdown right in the early days of the pandemic. And the government decided we got to do something about getting money to the people. In 3 days, they decided on a list of people, a button was pressed. That afternoon, everybody had money in their accounts. 300 million people got their first check, within a day of, once you decided the list of beneficiaries, that's all it took. So I think there are tremendous examples from India that show this, but this is proof for, like, I think Togo, when they used Novici to deliver aid to the marginalized, they found ways using telephone data and getting wallets to them to again get aid very quickly to people. And countries where they didn't have it, they were mailing checks, they were taking, months to get the checks in, and then just, big nightmare,
Right.
except where you were doing it digitally. So what we have seen happen in the last 5-6 years is really a revolution in how governments can service the needs of people, and they do it digitally, and they do it in a way that preserves privacy, preserves the power of the individual. So agency goes back to the individual in all of these situations. And that's something which has been very, very powerful. And so from a Gates Foundation perspective, when we are looking at all of these gaps around access to services and technologies around the world, this turns out to be a very powerful tool. And that's something we would love to make sure that every country in the world is able to serve the people as well. So that's why
So
we're
you're
interested.
effectively providing technical support to many of these low and middle income countries to be able to operationalize a
Exactly.
digital infrastructure system.
Yeah, so our goal is to make sure that we are able to get every low and middle income country to digitize in a way that they're able to do this cost effectively and efficiently.
Great, thank you. So turning to the question, I'd love to ask this to Consul General Gupta, right? How does this interact with private entities that are also engaging in some of the same behavior? Clearly not national identity, but certainly, digital payments, certainly cloud services. So do you feel that the government, right, is creating this big sort of highway infrastructure, right? Do you think that the government should displace these private entities, or the private entities should have a pathway into your infrastructure, but you regulate them, and thereby regulating antitrust in a lot of ways, right? You won't have the big Google and Amazon problem of taking over the world.
Thank you. A very good question. Before I answer that, just one point I missed, and I think which we all should understand, especially when we talk about the Indian digital story. Today, we have more digital penetration of DPI than what is our national literacy rate. So why I'm saying that is you have to understand the challenge that we would have faced when we were rolling this out. And to say that we will give a digital public good to somebody who is illiterate and he still be able to use it, and be able to use it in rural villages, and be able to understand it and execute it the way he wants. That is I would say, a sub-story within this larger story that you see at play here. So it has taken a lot of education and this being executed on such a large scale. Well, coming to the question. I can tell you from Government of India's experience that when we were trying to scale this up, we have consciously, particularly under this government, decided that it has to be a multi-stakeholder model, which is essentially anchored on public-private partnership. We call it a PPP approach, where the government invests in rolling out the basic infrastructure, lays down the ground rules of the game, and based on this bedrock infrastructure, every other stakeholder which is willing to play by what I would say is the essentials of this infrastructure, which should focus on inclusivity, accessibility, and affordability. As long as the private stakeholders are ensuring that these are also the three broad criteria, enabling them to take these services to beyond the domain of the government, to where the government cannot reach, their participation was most welcome. So in India, you would see Google Pay, Phone Pay, Paytm, all entering this space, and again, amplifying the subscriber base to way beyond where the government could reach. So it was, as I said, a PPP model that we experimented with. We are completely open to this being a level playing field for all the players involved. The only thing that is discouraged is we should not have a situation where a single company has a monopoly on this scaling out for public good. So we fully welcome private participation in this, but at the end of the day, the base structure on which, the backbone on which this has been built up has to come from the government. And I think that's largely a template which is being taken across in other settings as well. Thank you.
Thank you. So far, we've talked about all of the ways in which DPI has helped citizens, which actually is amazing. I think we could learn a lot from it here in the United States. Our COVID payment system was a mess, and there was so much fraud, and people didn't get the money. So I think in a way, India has these developing countries have leapfrogged, right? Where here we had landlines and then cell phones, and in places in India, you went straight to cell phones. So I think there's a lot to learn, but I also know that there's people who are skeptical of DPI, right? There's this notion of, is it too much information? Do we have an Orwellian big brother when we give all this information to the government? Cybercrime vulnerabilities. So what are some of these challenges you've encountered? Really starting with Sanjay in your work in the Gates Foundation, or just generally your knowledge of some of these problems to look out for?
I think it's important to recognize that any new technology, any new way comes with risks. And while we need to recognize it, we don't need to overplay it. But it was so. For example, we recently supported the UN putting together a DPI safeguards effort. So there was this committee of all the civil society stakeholders, as well as others, who worked with the UN Secretary Tech Envoy's office to come up with what we call DPI safeguards. They just released a report about 2-3 days ago. And broadly, the idea is that once you're aware of these, what you need to protect against, and then you design it into the system. And some of these things we learned from the Indian experience. We actually had in the Indian systems also privacy by design and security by design as principles when these systems were being built. But now they're formally in there. As the foundation, we worked with World Bank on laying down what are the principles of good ID, and we've endorsed those principles. And again, those are used when we go to different countries to make sure that those safeguards are in place. One of those safeguards is having an appropriate legal framework in which these systems are deployed, and so that citizens' rights are well listed and documented and are protected through those laws. And that's something which, again, we make sure through our work that while we are looking at how people can benefit, we also take care to protect those who are vulnerable from anything that could go wrong. So we go in with our eyes open, we understand what are the risks, we put in mitigations while the systems are being designed and built, and proceed with that. So it's a balance that we have to strive so we can get the best out of it while protecting against the worst.
Thank you. So you mentioned legal framework, and that's a great segue to invite Vidushi to talk about her experience in working for the Indian government to try to develop technology laws to regulate some of these issues, right? I mean, because for one thing, when you also have bank account information and all these other information at the hands of the government, one can also be politically motivated, certain, governments, not saying, there's risks, right? So how do you regulate the government? And I know law is, we're just catching up. These technologies are evolving so quickly that it's hard for us to even keep a pace, right? And law is very slow to change. So how have you dealt with that, or how does the Indian laws deal with it?
Thank you for that question. And that's a very relevant question, Professor Sital Kalantry. Thank you very much for inviting me to this panel. So regulation is a tricky affair when it comes to evolving technology all over the world. And when it comes to India, it is even more tricky because we have a vast country. We have inbuilt pluralism. There is a lot of diversity, and we have a vibrant democracy where the voices from each quarter of the section of society has to be considered, has to be deliberated upon before a policy can be formulated. And for that purpose, we have rounds and rounds of public discourse. We have multi-stakeholder discussions. We call experts to give their views, and only then we are able to form an outline of a policy or draft a legislation. Besides that, India is a keen onlooker of all the developments that are taking place all over the world, and in particular, the AI Act of European Union and the General Data Protection Regulation of EU, as well as the California Consumer Privacy Rights Act, as we all know, is very progressive, and it has the consumers' interests at the center. And we are keeping a close watch. And in fact, we have drafted our own legislations, which also keep the individual at the center. And data privacy and data protection of the individual's information is at the core of it. For regulation and for regulatory frameworks to be constructed, we have to go back to our constitution. And the Constitution of India, in the directive principles of state policy, talks about the principles that are to be adhered to by the regulators while constructing these frameworks. So, for instance, Article 38 says that the state will strive to promote the welfare of the people. And it says that it will try to minimize the inequalities in income and eliminate inequalities in status, facilities, and opportunities. So, inclusion and equitable growth. These are two cardinal principles that we have to keep in mind when we are trying to create a regulation, a draft of a law or policy. That being said, and I've already said we have multi-stakeholder discussions to arrive at a consensus kind, because we are a democracy, as we all know here. Uh, Privacy has been a big concern for us. And the entire story, in fact, took a very important turn with Aadhaar being challenged in the Supreme Court. The Aadhaar project was for creating a unique digital identity for the entire populace that was residing in the territory of the country, because it was felt that around 40% of people did not have any kind of documentary proof to say who they were. And that was a mind-blowing crisis, because a welfare state has to deliver services to its people. And there are people who are living below the poverty line, people who are living in far-fetched areas of the country, which are very difficult to reach because of the geographies. There are deserts, oceans, floods, Himalayas, all kind of terrain. So therefore, we needed a technology to be able to reach to the unreached people. And for that purpose, Aadhaar was born. And Aadhaar, the collection of biometric information, was challenged in the Supreme Court vis-a-vis the privacy of the individual. And the Supreme Court came out with a landmark judgment, which is popularly known as the Puttaswamy judgment, where a 91-year-old justice, retired justice, went to the Supreme Court to ask whether the right to privacy was fundamental to the fundamental rights which are given in the constitution of the country. And the Supreme Court said, yes, the right to privacy is integral to the fundamental rights, and that to the core fundamental right of right to life and personal liberty. That is Article 21. And that being said, whenever there is a regulatory framework to be created or constructed, we have to keep in mind the tenets that were laid down by the Puttaswamy judgment. And they gave a proportionality test. They said that if the intrusion into your privacy is balanced with the benefit that is to be given, then you can go ahead with that scheme. But if the benefit that is going to be given to you is lesser than the intrusion into your privacy, sorry, we cannot have that scheme. That is what the Puttaswamy judgment said. And it also said that the scheme that is being devised has to have a legislative backing. So unless you have a law that backs it, for instance, in the Income Tax Act, we were supposed to mention our Aadhaar 12-digit ID. And that again was, taken to court. And the court said that, okay, the IT Act will have to amend. And then they included this in the IT Act. And then we went ahead and we were okay with giving our ID in the income tax returns. So, so we are going ahead, and we have already passed the Digital Personal Data Protection Act that again puts the data principle, that is the person whose data is being collected and processed for professional purposes and lawful purposes. And the data principle is at the core of the legislation, and it is consent-based. And the data principle has a right to amend the information, to change the information, and also ask for erasure of the information. So that is almost analogous to what we have in the European Union's GDPR, which is Article 17, where you have the right to be forgotten. So, and of course, we have the California Privacy Rights Act, and we are also coming up with a Digital India Act, where again, we are trying to mitigate the harms of fake news and information wars, and the distinction between right and wrong, true and fake. All these things will be taken care of in the new act. And also, over the past few years, we have reviewed and repealed many of the legislations. So because we knew that the technology is evolving and we need to catch up, we have reviewed all the legislations that had a bearing on technology. So that action has been carried out over the last years, and a lot of new acts have been made, a lot of amendments have been made in the Copyright Act, in the Patent Act. We have a new Telecommunications Act. The previous one was in the 19th century. Now we have it in the 2023. So we are moving forward and we are making all these amendments.
Thank you so much, Vidushi. That was really, really interesting and informative. And I would say, as somebody like me, who's a law professor who studies legal transplants, one thing I wanted to just point out is this Swami decision created the right to privacy in the Indian constitution, which didn't exist previously. And one of the sources on which they based their decision was Roe v. Wade, which is also what created the right to privacy in the US. But of course, we no longer have that, but they continue to have that right to privacy in India. So let me move to Professor Bakiner for this question, right? As a scholar who studies technology and ethics and human rights around internet and other technologies, what do you think about all these things? What are your concerns? What are your comments? What are your questions?
Of course. First of all, thank you very much for having me. I would like to thank Roundglass India Center. I am not an expert on India. I would like to sort of offer maybe a more comparative insight. And usually, in this role as Director of Technology Ethics Initiative, when I talk, I'm usually talking about why something will not work or why it doesn't work. So I'm really happy to talk about something that has actually worked for a change. And so maybe we should focus on the word public in digital public infrastructure a little bit. I know that there were a lot of definitional debates, especially in last year's G20 summit organized by India. And so public might mean publicly owned, or it might mean public interest. And I think the definition that most practitioners now agree on is that it is a public interest, that DPI should serve some kind of public good. And so, as Consul General was saying, for example, accessibility, inclusion, affordability, these could be values that are embedded in infrastructural technology like DPI. And I think that also says something about perhaps DPI as something that forces us to rethink our notions of technology in the following way. For the most part, I think when we talk about digital technology, we are looking at it from the perspective of consumers, especially in the United States. Like, we buy and sell things through digital data, or, as the saying goes, if the platform is free, you are the product. But, the idea is that we participate in our capacity as consumers. And DPI, I think, wants to change that and tries to include people in the digital economy as citizens, right? So not just as potential buyers and sellers, which could also result from DPI, say something like a unified payment interface, but more fundamentally, it includes people in their quality as citizens. So in that way, I think it does force a rethink. Now, concerns. I think all infrastructure brings concerns about government control. This one is no exception. Again, to give maybe an imperfect sort of historical precedent, railroads, which had been pretty much used for benign and useful purposes throughout their almost 200-year history, were also instrumental to something like the Holocaust. Now, this in and of itself doesn't mean that the railroad is the problem, right? It means that a certain type of government, a totalitarian government, can actually sort of usurp existing public infrastructure, to use it towards evil ends. And of course, it is possible that with DPI, now that it's sort of becoming a global phenomenon, this could be the result. But I think here the emphasis should not be so much on what the infrastructure can do, but rather on why we should sort of fight for democracy and inclusion around the world to make sure that these infrastructural technologies are used for the common good and not for something else. So in that way, I guess I am less worried about the sort of the infrastructure than the than the sort of the broader global politics that is surrounding it. And similar things, of course, can be said about sort of privacy concerns as well. Now, one topic that came up multiple times is also the degree of sort of digital literacy that is required to use sort of maybe the applications that result from the underlying infrastructure. And so I think making that as accessible as possible is also very important for realizing this sort of democratic citizenship gain that comes from DPI. And finally, perhaps one other thing that I should add is that DPI and public trust really go hand in hand. One, pre-existing public trust really, I think, does an important job in promoting DPI and all the sort of more practical applications that result from it. I think where public trust is low towards government, towards any data collection agency, people might actually sort of respond relatively negatively to something like DPI. But also, there's a second sort of side to that relationship. I think the more that people see DPI being used benignly for useful ways or to useful ends, I think the more likely that they are going to trust, the sort of infrastructure that we're talking about. Again, the fact that DPI has spread across South Asia, Southeast Asia, parts of Africa, parts of East and Northeast Europe, and Latin America shows that by and large, I think the buy-in for this kind of technology is large on the part of global citizenry.
So I appreciate the comments and reflections on what we should be thinking about and be cautious of. So my question to both you, Consul General and Sanjay, Jain, is really twofold. One, how do you see India and how do you see Gates Foundation working to promote this around the world? What are you doing? How are you doing it? And also, what do you think it's important for people to know about? We have a lot of people watching on Zoom, a lot of people here. What challenges, what opportunities do you want to mention about DPI?
Look, in India's case, we have tried this out, I would say, over the last decade. And as I said, found it to be the biggest transformational tool that the government has used for delivery of public goods. Given that context, we find that there are so many other developing countries who are in a similar setting where the population profile and government priorities are in urgent need of a similar solution. And in keeping with our, I would say, ethos since independence, which is solidarity within the Global South, we want to share this for the best benefit of the entire developing world. And in that sense, I'm very happy to inform you that in the last couple of years itself, we have signed MOUs with 8 countries, including with Armenia, Sierra Leone, Trinidad and Tobago, offering them access to the India digital stack and the DPI backbone at zero cost, at no cost to these 8 countries with open source resources. Moreover, one thing which I'm also very happy to inform you is bilaterally, we have gone about ensuring that our UPI financial platforms integrate with those of other countries so that Indian solutions like PhonePe or the other digital payment platforms that we offer in India can be used in other countries as well. And as of date, you could use it in Bhutan, Nepal, Sri Lanka, Mauritius, UAE, Singapore, and France. So again, I see some Indian student faces here. 3 years back, you could not use the phone pay in France. Now, if you travel to France and if you have that app, you can make that payment in France. It's a European country. It's gone beyond the South Asian domain where you can use it. This is a very, very positive takeaway for people who are traveling across geographies. The third part is how we look at this, India's worldview of this issue. So somebody made a mention of India's G20 presidency last year. So when we undertook the G20 presidency, we really, and again, G20 was essentially an economic club that came together in the aftermath of the financial crisis, where most of the countries which came in its initial wave were the developed countries. And again, based on the size of economies and how it was going. We really wanted the interests of the global South to be at the forefront of the G20 agenda. And that's why we made the African Union become a permanent member during our G20 presidency. It could not happen for the last 14 years, but it happened last year. And during that initiative, during our presidency, we made sure that the G20 also adopted what we called the Global DPI repository, which is a best practices of how the DPI is being implemented, not just in the Indian setting, but in other settings as well. And I'm sure Sanjay ji from Gates Foundation will speak about how the MOSIP experience is being implemented in other 16 countries. Philippines tried to implement it. It achieved, I believe, close to 99% identity cards based on the Aadhaar experience. And once they implemented it in their country, the request for enrollment for bank accounts increased by 175% because they could see this benefit coming to them immediately. This is a case in Southeast Asia. And so we have cases across 16 countries, Ethiopia, Morocco, all these countries are implementing it. So I think the Indian DPI is a very uniquely placed success story, which needs greater understanding, not just in the South, but also in the North. Because the spin-offs are on various dimensions. And I think with discussions like this, we can really scale this up and foster a better understanding of how do we take public good directly in the hands of people themselves.
Thank you, Prakash ji, for that. So from the Gates Foundation perspective, I think what we are looking at is exactly this, is to take the DPI story global. We are doing that through so like I said, we are supporting payment systems around the world. We're supporting ID systems. Prakash ji mentioned MOSIP. So MOSIP is a project, an open source ID project being developed at IIIT Bangalore and is now being used by 25 countries have signed a MOU with IIIT Bangalore to implement it. Of these, the ones that are live are Philippines, Morocco, Ethiopia, and then there are others which are in the process of procuring services to go take it live. And that will eventually lead to, I think, about 500 million people getting IDs out of that. In addition to this, we are also supporting other DPI projects around the world. And to sort of take a step back, what we did was try and understand what is DPI. We learned from the Indian experience, but we also saw what's happening in Estonia, in Singapore, in Brazil. And he sort of came up with a definition of DPI. And then some researchers went back and said, okay, if we take this definition, what else is a DPI? And they found lots of examples around the world where many governments had used the similar approaches to doing, individual projects, not necessarily at the same scale as what you've seen in India, but at least the basic understanding of how to build these systems, et cetera, does exist. And we are now in the process of taking those. So we are going beyond ID. We're looking at and payments to look at data exchange. We are looking at the same approach to how do we take language technology and create AI on top of that so that voice recognition can be done, so people can access, can use their language to access the internet and all its power. And because today, if you look at all the AI developments, it leaves behind everything that's not English. And so for low resource languages, it's very important that we create a public good that allows them to be a part of the same ecosystem. And so we are basically taking a look at all of these places where technology can play a role in bringing access, in bringing equity, in building these developments so that the entire world's population can be included.
Great.
And so that's really been the effort from the foundation. And India is a great partner in that because a lot of it's a shining example that has, sort of allowed people to appreciate what
Right.
it can do. And I think that helps all of these other efforts as well.
It's amazing to see how India has been at the forefront and a leader in the DPI revolution. And what I would love to open it up to questions as well as people from the hybrid Zoom can also ask questions. But then as I close, maybe just finally, I know Vidushi came here to study technology law and learn about LLMs. And I know your professor is here as well, but I would like to hear from you what you have possibly gained and you learned, because it seems to me like we have a lot to learn from India. So I'm wondering if there's you wanted to make a final point on that.
Thank you once again for this very good opportunity. And yes, from the office room to the classroom, it's been a very amazing jump for me. And while dealing with technology, I realized that the regulator has to first understand the technology, because unless we know the nuances of the technology, and especially a disruptive technology, which is evolving at such a rapid pace, and all over the world, people are absolutely bamboozled by this pace. So I needed to upgrade myself, and that was the reason why I came here. And the classrooms here are so good, and the professors are so good. They ignite our minds, and there is a very enriching discussion. And I'm also learning about the laws in the US. There is no federal law in the US also for controlling AI, for regulating AI, which is a challenge for all of us. And because we also look upon the US and we try to learn from what's happening here. And the regulatory bodies here, like the FTC and the SEC, have done some amazing work in reining in big tech firms like Google and Meta and Microsoft, and those are very great learnings. Like, for instance, I follow the work of Lena Khan and how she's able to find them. It's not easy. It's extremely difficult, and how the Communication Decency Act is being utilized by the big techs, and how the courts are trying to balance the freedom of speech and profit making and commercial interests, and also the individual's freedom of speech has to be protected. So ongoing debates like that in the US is extremely useful for me. And of course, I'm going to take back all this, and
Great.
I'm sure that I'll be able to do a better job with your blessings.
No,
Thank you.
Thank you so much. There's a lot for us to learn from both of our countries, because our constitutions contain very similar rights, and we're both democracies. So I think the laws are very applicable in both countries. So are there questions that people would like to ask? Yes, Meenakshi. First.
Such a exact session in such a short period of time, so stay here for longer and chat about things. It's no small feat to have a digital payments interface leapfrog India from where it was to where it is. So Onur did a good job of sketching that out. Now, I actually was enamored of the metaphor you used. The government is going to pay the bedrock and provide the rules of the game. Now that for me, I'm an economist, full disclosure, so I'm going to use my own terminology. Access to finance is a big impediment in person's growth, in the nation's economic growth and development. But what the government has done with the UPI, or the digital payments interface, has created a supply of financial services. Now, where access to finance is concerned, equity and access, and I think Onur, you talked about it, requires that there be a demand for these financial services. It's not enough to bring the poor to a bank and open a bank account, right? We need to have a demand for financial services, maybe bring financial services to the poor. By financial services, we don't just mean opening a bank account, because, opening a bank account and using a bank account are two different things, as you know. I think there's a huge gender divide on that as well. So, there will be a bank account. The government will provide, the Jan Dhan Yojana, etc., into the bank account. But how is the a person, who are they using that account? what are services that I'm talking about? Not just payments mechanism, your micro savings, micro loans, micro insurance, stuff like that. And I think that financial literacy education is a big lacuna, not just in India. I'm talking in terms of the United States as well. Financial literacy education is sorely lacking. And so I would like to know what some of the initiatives are in not bringing just the poor to a bank and creating an account, but bringing financial services, which is a larger term, to the poor and overcoming the gender divide through financial literacy education.
So just to, I wanted to repeat the question for people on Zoom, summarize it. Great question by Professor Rishi, who's a part of our business school. She wanted to know, how do we go beyond just opening bank accounts, but bringing financial literacy education to women and other people who may not know how to use it, and providing other similar services?
Thank you. It's a very, I would say, a very interesting question, because it's a challenge that all governments grapple with. But thankfully, we've been able to overcome that challenge. And how we've gone about it, I'll let you know. First aspect is the issue of the gender digital divide that we face in India sometimes. I would say in the India's DPI story, when we went about the Jan Dhan account Yojana, we were not able to just create bank accounts for close to 550 million women who were part of the self-help group, who were originally doing money deposits, cash deposits in small scales. But we were also able to direct them to use that amount for essential family benefit schemes. And let me come to that, how that worked out. Because that is linked to the first part of the question, where you say, it's not just a question of opening a bank account and parking the government money there, or parking a government initiative there. How do you get to use it? If you would have heard about, there is another scheme called the Ayushman Bharat initiative, which is ensuring that anybody who is below a certain income level, who are, I would say, largely the beneficiaries of the Jan Dhan Yojana, if they need access to basic medical care and they need compensation for that, if your account is linked to the Ayushman initiative, then you are getting medical compensation at government cost. Now, this is a very basic requirement that most people in villages face. Treatment, how do you get compensated? Because medical costs are even increasing there. So I know of instances where the younger generation has availed of initiatives, gone back, and it is the elder female class, the 70-year-old plus, who has heard that, look, he has done this. He's availed of this facility in the hospital, and it has been compensated because the account was linked to the Ayushman scheme. There was not a physical transaction while availing of medical services. So how did it work around in this case? We had an example where somebody was largely illiterate, but got incentivized because of situations where other people availed of the benefit, and the person who would have been otherwise dormant got attracted to availing the scheme. All these schemes that the government has put out, whether it's housing, whether it is health, whether it's education, are now kind of being necessarily linked to one or other of the UPI payment platforms or the digital payment platforms. So the fact is that the basic user will like to avail of one of these three services, right? If they have to go up the social chain. And if they have to do that, they will have to avail of making the account operational. So to put the long story short, I would say it is just the benefits across the social spectrum that it entails to the individual user is the most single biggest appealing factor to operationalize the account rather than just create the account, which in my view acts as a very good incentive in rural settings across India. Perhaps you can add.
Actually, I think you answered that. I wanted to add only one more element to it, which was the business correspondent network. So that, because there's a big distance to the bank branch, and having a person cash in other countries, it would be called a Kiko network, cash in, cash out. But in India, it's a business correspondent network that allows access to banking services in your region. And more recently, the India Post, the postman can do banking at home. So when somebody when the postman comes to your house, you can actually withdraw money from him. And that's been a service that's been provided. So overall, I think the use of digital technology to make banking portable has, I think, helped a lot in access terms. I think the rest of it's Consul General has already answered.
I would just add,
Yeah.
with the permission of the chair. Actually, technology has been leveraged by the government to bridge these divides like rural and urban and gender and people who are living in far-fetched areas. And for instance, the pension scheme, old people are not able to take pension unless they are able to certify that they are alive. And because of this digital platform, now they don't have to travel from their homes. They can prove that they are alive and they don't have to go to the babus or, to a government office to plead and to ask for pension. So these are, and the postman can also facilitate and take if they don't have the smartphone, the postman can take it to their home. So this is something which is wonderful, and technology is bridging people, it's bringing together people. And the literacy is of no significance. So people who are illiterate are able to utilize technology to reach the services which otherwise they would not, because they are not literate. So technology has also been leveraged to bridge the gaps. So of course, financial literacy will always be required and it has its significance. But for the government of India, we have to reach the service today, whereas the literacy will take time to spread. So to reach the person who has to avail of the services, medical services through Ayushman Bharat, for those kind of reasons, I think Aadhaar and UPI have done a wonderful job, and technology is very empowering. And that is what we have seen in India.
Thank you. So to shift a little gears, Professor Bakiner, how do you see us in the United States, particularly Seattle, benefiting from DPI? And what models do we want to import? What models do we not want to import? And what safeguards, like if you were creating this, hired by Seattle to say, let's bring DPI, or what safeguards would you put in?
Okay, a great question. Two concepts that I think we should sort of, really think about here. One is trust, and the other one is intentionality. So I'll start with trust. So how many of you have the CDC issued COVID vaccine cards? So I've had my fair share of adventures while traveling in Europe in 2021 with that card that like nobody else in the world pretty much understood. And so fast forward 3 years, this June, we organized a conference on healthcare and AI here at Seattle University. And something that participants sort of agreed on was that healthcare data in the United States are sort of fragmented across hospitals, centers, as well as states. And so there's institutional fragmentation. But if you remember those days in 2020, 2021, it wasn't just fragmentation. People had came up with all sorts of conspiracy theories around, vaccines and mask mandates and stuff like that, which made it very difficult really for anybody to implement either an application solution, much less sort of an underlying sort of infrastructural solution to the problem of bringing together healthcare data. And so without some sort of public trust, I think it'll be very difficult to sort of, renovate our infrastructures. And then intentionality. There is this great quote by Ethan Zuckerman, UMass Amherst professor, that I want to read. He says, Facebook was designed not to enable citizenship, but to display ads to users. So in other words, the intention behind a lot of our public infrastructure really didn't have much to do with public exercise of citizenship or anything like that. And so if we are going to change that sort of infrastructure in ways that are public serving, we really need to get more intentional about what it serves, which population groups it claims to serve, and so on and so forth. So that is, I think, maybe sort of a very generic answer to your question. But in terms of specific guardrails, I think, a big sort of step forward would be some sort of digital well, data privacy and protection legislation in the United States that is at the federal level. I think that is, one thing that is still lacking. And then, we didn't have a long conversation about AI and stuff like that because, most of our conversation was sort of at the infrastructure level. But again, AI means data. And so, any aspect of data collection, storage, and analysis that sort of these infrastructures enable need to be regulated as well.
Thank you. So I think we are out of time, but I would love to invite some of our panelists to stay and invite you all to ask questions if you do have of them. And thank you. Please join me in thanking everyone on this panel for their great conversation.
And I must thank Professor Sital
Of
Kalantry
course.
for moderating this so excellently as always. This is I think the second or third panel which you have done, at least in
Yeah.
my presence.
Thank you.
And you had always been outstanding. Thank you so much.
Thank you. We're so grateful to have you here.
Thank you for
Thank
having
you.
us.